Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I've spent 15 years reading the stories that maps tell, not the obvious stories, the geography and borders and place names, the hidden stories, the mistakes that reveal what cartographers didn't understand, the blank spaces that show what they feared, the artistic choices that expose their biases and beliefs. Every old map is a window into the mind of the person who made it, and I've made a career out of looking through those windows. My name is Kellan Pryor. I'm 41 years old. I work as a senior appraiser for Whitfield and Associates, an auction house in Boston that specializes in rare maps, historical documents, and cartographic artifacts. When someone dies and leaves behind a collection of antique maps, or when a museum needs to value its holdings, or when a collector wants to sell a piece they've owned for decades, they call people like me. I examine the maps, research their provenance, assess their condition, and determine what they're worth. It's quiet work, detailed work, the kind of work that suits someone who prefers objects to people. I've been divorced once, came close to marrying again and didn't, and I live alone in an apartment filled with books about places I'll never visit. My father was a geography professor who traveled constantly when I was a child. Maybe I inherited his fascination with maps. I definitely didn't inherit his wanderlust. My father died 3 years ago. Stroke. Quick and painless, the doctor said. I delivered a eulogy at his funeral and realized halfway through that I was describing a stranger. We'd never been close. Not really. There was always a distance between us that I could never bridge, a coldness I could never warm. I blamed myself for years. Thought I wasn't trying hard enough, wasn't being a good enough son. Now I know the truth. The distance wasn't my fault. And it wasn't his fault either. It wasn't him at all. 3 months ago, I was hired to appraise the cartographic collection of the late Victor Aldrich. Aldrich was a wealthy eccentric who spent 60 years accumulating maps and related documents. His collection was enormous, over 3,000 items spanning 5 centuries. Portuguese naval charts from the age of exploration, Dutch trade maps from the golden age of cartography, British imperial surveys, American frontier sketches, everything from illuminated medieval mappamundi to 19th century railroad surveys. It was the biggest job of my career. I set up a workspace in the climate-controlled storage facility where the collection was housed and began the slow process of cataloging, researching, and appraising each piece. About 6 weeks in, I started noticing something strange. Maps from different eras, different cultures, different cartographic traditions, they all had certain locations marked the same way. Not the same locations, but the same treatment. Small areas scattered across the globe that map makers consistently identified as places not to go. Sometimes they were left blank, even when the surrounding territory was mapped in detail. Sometimes they were marked with symbols that translated to warnings. Forbidden, do not enter, none return. The standard explanation for blank spaces on old maps is ignorance. Map makers left areas empty because they didn't know what was there. Terra incognita, unknown land. But these blank spaces didn't fit that pattern. They were surrounded by detailed, accurate cartography. The map makers clearly knew the regions. They just chose not to document certain areas within them. I found a Portuguese chart from 1523 that showed the coast of Brazil in meticulous detail. Every bay and headland carefully rendered, except for one small area that was simply empty. A notation in the margin, translated from archaic Portuguese, read, "Let no Christian man enter here." I found a Chinese map from the Ming Dynasty that depicted the interior provinces with precision, except for a mountainous region marked only with a symbol that the catalogue described as meaning forbidden territory. I found an Ottoman map, a Venetian map, a map drawn by Jesuit missionaries in the 1600s. Different places, different cartographers, different centuries, but the same treatment. Small areas marked as forbidden, dangerous, not to be entered. I thought it was coincidence at first, or maybe a shared cartographic convention I wasn't familiar with. So I started researching. That's when I found the correspondence. Victor Aldrich didn't just collect maps. He collected everything related to maps. Journals from expeditions, notes from map dealers, and letters. Hundreds of letters between cartographers spanning 3 centuries, discussing their craft, sharing techniques, debating the accuracy of various sources. Some of those letters discussed the forbidden zones. I found a letter from 1568, written by a Portuguese cartographer to a colleague in Spain. He described meeting Arab navigators in Lisbon who told him about certain places that should never be mapped, places where travelers who entered came back wrong. The Portuguese cartographer had heard similar stories from sailors who'd explored the African coast. He and his colleague agreed to mark these locations with warnings and share the knowledge with other map makers. I found a letter from 1642, written by a Dutch cartographer who referenced ancient Greek texts that warned of the same phenomenon. Locations where people who entered were somehow changed, replaced. The Greeks had marked these places on their maps. So had the Romans. So had the Arabs and the Chinese and every other civilization that developed sophisticated cartography. The knowledge was passed down across cultures and centuries. Map makers who never met, who spoke different languages and served different empires, all agreed on the same thing. Certain locations should be marked as forbidden, and no one should ever go there. I found a letter from 1743 that explained why. It was written by a French cartographer named Duplessis to a colleague in Vienna. The handwriting was cramped and difficult to read, but I managed to translate most of it. Duplessis described meeting the widow of an explorer who had ventured into one of the forbidden zones in the Canadian wilderness. The explorer had returned safely. He looked the same. He sounded the same. He remembered everything about his life, his wife, his children, his work. But his wife knew something was wrong. Small things at first, preferences that had changed, habits that were different, ways of speaking that were slightly off. Over time, the wrongness grew more obvious. The man who had come back from that expedition was not her husband. He wore her husband's face, spoke with her husband's voice, carried her husband's memories. But he was not her husband. Duplessis wrote, "The man who enters is not the man who leaves. Something wears his face and lives his life. The original is simply gone, replaced by something that mimics him with terrible precision. We mark these places so that no more men are taken. This is the sacred duty of our craft, passed down from the ancients. We do not map the forbidden territories. We only warn. I read that letter 3 times. My hands were shaking by the end. I spent the next 2 weeks cross-referencing the correspondence with the maps in the Aldrich collection. I identified the locations that were consistently marked as forbidden. There were dozens of them, scattered across every continent. Small areas, easy to miss. Some were remote wilderness. Some were inside what are now major cities. Some were in places that millions of people pass through every year. I searched for modern information about these locations. I found scattered reports, missing persons cases where the person was later found alive, but their families insisted something was wrong with them. Travelers who came back from certain regions with personality changes their loved ones couldn't explain. Hikers who returned from wilderness trips, not themselves, according to spouses and children who knew them best. Nothing conclusive. Nothing that would make headlines. Just a pattern, if you knew to look for it. Then I found Victor Aldrich's research notes. Aldrich wasn't just a collector. He was an investigator. He'd spent decades studying the forbidden zones, which he called replacement territories. He tracked cases. He interviewed families who reported that loved ones returned different from trips to certain areas. He compiled evidence that something real was happening in these locations. Among his papers, I found a list. Names of people Aldrich believed had been replaced. Some were historical figures, explorers and cartographers who visited the forbidden zones centuries ago. But some were recent. People Aldrich had met, observed, confirmed his suspicions about. One name on the list made me stop breathing. Kellan Pryor, my father. Next to the name, Aldrich had written, confirmed. Location, northern Manitoba, Canada. Date of replacement, August 1993. Met subject in 2015. Subtle but unmistakable markers of substitution present. August 1993. I was 12 years old. I remember that summer. My father took a research trip to northern Canada, studying glacial formations for a paper he was writing. He was gone for 3 weeks. When he came back, something was different. I could never articulate what changed. He looked the same, sounded the same, knew everything he should know. He remembered my birthday, my favorite foods, the names of my friends, all the details of our life together. But there was a distance that hadn't been there before, a coldness I couldn't explain. My mother noticed too. I remember her watching him in the weeks after the trip, a worried expression on her face. She'd start to say something, then stop herself. What could she say? Her husband was right there. He was the same person. He just felt different somehow. I told myself I was imagining things. Kids notice changes in their parents that aren't really there. People come back from trips a little different because travel changes you. My father was stressed from work, tired from the journey, preoccupied with his research. The distance between us was normal, the ordinary growing apart that happens between fathers and sons. That's what I told myself for 29 years. Now I pulled up my father's academic records. I found the paper about glacial formations. I traced the research trip, the exact location where he conducted his fieldwork, and I compared it to the forbidden zones marked On the ancient maps in the R. Aldrich collection, the coordinates matched. My father went into one of the replacement territories. 3 weeks later, he came out. But was it him? I sat in the storage facility surrounded by 3,000 maps and 5 centuries of warnings, and I thought about my childhood. The father who taught me to ride a bike a few months after that trip. The father who helped me with homework, who attended my baseball games, who drove me to college and shook my hand when I graduated. The father who was there for my wedding, my divorce, my second almost wedding, my career struggles, all the ordinary moments of an ordinary life. Was any of it real? Was the person I called Dad actually my father? Or was it something else? Something wearing his face, carrying his memories, living his life. I thought about the distance between us, the coldness I could never understand, the feeling I'd had my entire adult life that I didn't really know my father, that there was something between us that couldn't be bridged. Maybe the distance wasn't a failure of our relationship. Maybe it was the only honest thing about it. Maybe some part of me always knew on a level I couldn't articulate that the man who came back from Canada wasn't the man who left. Aldrich's research notes included his observations about the replacements. They weren't malicious, he wrote. They didn't seem to have any agenda or purpose. They just lived their lives, indistinguishable from normal humans, except for subtle wrongness that only people who knew them intimately would notice. And even then, the changes were easy to rationalize. People grow, people change. It doesn't mean anything. The replacements had all the memories of the originals, all the knowledge, the skills, the relationships. They could pass every test you could devise. The only evidence that anything was wrong was a feeling, an intuition, the sense that someone you loved was somehow not themselves. Aldrich estimated that there could be tens of thousands of replacements living among normal humans, maybe more. Most people who enter the forbidden zones are fine, he wrote. They pass through without triggering whatever process causes the substitution. But some percentage, maybe 1 in 1,000, maybe 1 in 10,000, come back as something else. The original doesn't die. As far as Aldrich could determine, they don't get trapped somewhere. They just cease to exist. One moment, they're walking through a forest, or climbing a mountain, or hiking a trail. The next moment, something else is walking in their body, carrying their memories, going home to their families. Aldrich speculated about what the replacements actually were. His best guess was that the forbidden zones were places where our reality touched something else, where the boundary between here and somewhere else was thin enough for a swap to occur. The person who enters passes through to that other place. Something from that place passes through to here. It's not an invasion. It's not a plan. It's just a phenomenon, natural as erosion or gravity. People go in. Something comes out. The world continues, and almost no one notices the difference. I finished appraising the Aldrich collection. It took another month. I wrote my reports, valued the maps, prepared everything for auction. The collection sold for over $12 million, most of it going to museums and universities. The correspondence and research notes went to a private buyer who paid a premium for the lot. I didn't tell anyone what I'd learned. Who would believe me? And even if they did, what could anyone do? The forbidden zones aren't going anywhere. People will keep traveling to them, keep passing through, keep occasionally being replaced by something that wears their face and lives their life. I live with the knowledge now. I notice things I never noticed before. The way certain areas on maps are marked as restricted, protected, inaccessible. National parks with trails that are permanently closed. Wilderness areas where permits are never granted. Mountain passes that no road ever crosses. Sometimes there are legitimate reasons. Sometimes, I suspect, the reasons have been forgotten, but the restrictions remain. I pay attention to people who travel, friends who visit remote locations, colleagues who go on trips to wilderness areas. I watch them when they come back, looking for the subtle signs of wrongness, the small changes that might mean they're not who they used to be. I never find anything conclusive. That's the horror of it. You can never be certain. The replacements are too perfect, too complete. They remember everything. They act normal. They love their families and do their jobs and live their lives. The only evidence that anything is wrong is a feeling, and feelings can be explained away. I visit my father's grave sometimes. It's in a cemetery outside Boston, next to my mother, who died 5 years before him. I stand there, and I don't know who I'm mourning. The father who went to Canada in 1993 and never came back, or the thing that lived in his house for 29 years, raising his son, loving his wife, dying in his bed. I've decided it doesn't matter. Whoever or whatever my father became after that trip, they were still present, still showed up, still did the work of being a father, however imperfectly. The distance between us was real, but so were the moments of connection. The thing wearing my father's face walked me through my darkest times. It celebrated my successes. It was there, in whatever way it could be there. Maybe that's the most unsettling part. The replacement was good enough. The substitution was complete enough. I lived my entire life with something that wasn't my father, and I never knew for certain that anything was wrong. I found an old photograph last week. I was going through boxes in my closet, looking for something else, and I came across a picture I hadn't seen in years. My father, my mother, and me. I was maybe 13. We were at a lake somewhere, a family vacation. My father had his arm around me. He was smiling. I studied the photograph for a long time. I looked at his eyes, searching for some sign of wrongness, some evidence of substitution, some proof that the man in the picture wasn't really my father. I didn't find it. He looked happy. He looked normal. He looked like a father who loved his son. Maybe he was. Maybe the whole thing is nonsense, a conspiracy theory assembled from coincidence and grief and the need to explain why I never felt close to my father. Maybe Aldrich was a delusional old man who saw patterns that weren't there. Maybe the ancient mapmakers were superstitious fools who marked locations as forbidden for reasons that had nothing to do with replacement or substitution. But then I think about the correspondence. Cartographers who never met, who lived centuries apart, who spoke different languages and served different empires. All of them warning about the same thing. All of them marking the same locations. All of them passing down the same knowledge. Some places should never be entered, and the people who enter them don't come back. Something else does. I think about my father coming home from that trip when I was 12. The way my mother looked at him in the weeks afterward, the distance that opened between us and never closed. I think about all the people I've known who came back from trips somehow different. The explanations we give ourselves. Travel changes you. People grow apart. Relationships are complicated. I think about how many of those explanations might be wrong. Ancient maps mark places we're not supposed to go. I used to think the warnings were about death, about dangers that would kill you if you entered the forbidden territories. Now I know the truth is worse. The forbidden places don't kill you. They just make sure that whoever comes back isn't you. I look at old photographs of my father and I try to remember what he was like before that trip. I was 12. My memories from that age are fragmentary, unreliable. I can't be certain what he was like before and what he was like after. I can't prove that anything changed. But I remember a feeling, a warmth that was there and then wasn't. A connection that existed and then didn't. A father who felt like my father, and then a father who felt like a stranger wearing a familiar face. I'll never know for certain what happened in Canada in 1993. I'll never know if my father walked into the wilderness and something else walked out. I'll never know if the man who raised me for the next 29 years was the man who held me when I was born. But I know this. The ancient map makers were trying to warn us. Across cultures, across centuries, they marked the same places with the same warnings. They knew what happened to travelers who ignored the warnings and entered the forbidden territories. The travelers didn't die. They didn't disappear. They came home to their families, lived their lives, grew old, and passed away like everyone else. They just weren't themselves anymore. I'm careful now about where I travel. I check old maps before I book trips. I avoid the locations that cartographers across history marked as forbidden. I tell myself it's paranoia, superstition, the irrational response to a story I can't prove. But I think about my father's eyes in that photograph. The smile that might have belonged to him, or might have belonged to something else. The 29 years I spent with someone who might have been my father, or might have been a perfect imitation. I think about how I'll never know the difference. And I think about all the people out there right now, booking trips to remote locations, hiking into wilderness areas, traveling to places that the ancient maps marked with warnings. Most of them will be fine. Most of them will come home exactly as they left. But some of them won't. Some of them will walk into the forbidden territories, and something else will walk out. Their families will notice the change, the subtle wrongness, the distance that opens up for no apparent reason. They'll tell themselves it doesn't mean anything. People change. Travel changes you. Relationships are complicated. And they'll spend the rest of their lives with something that wears the face of someone they love. That's the horror the ancient mapmakers tried to warn us about. Not death, not danger, something worse. The forbidden places take you away, and they send something back in your place. I look at my father's photograph one more time. I study his eyes. I search for answers I'll never find. Then I put the photograph away and try not to think about who's looking back.